Look, we all know that when it comes to any sort of judicial review of the actions or crimes of the Bush administration, Obama has made it crystal clear that he's only concerned with looking forward, not backward on the matter. Having said that, tonight, Showtime is premiering a new film about former Vice President Dick Cheney. Check it out.
If you want to really know a man's character, give him power.
When I'd first arrived there back in 1968, I was one of the youngest people in West Wing, and this time around I was the oldest. If we had been able to take out one of those airplanes headed for the World Trade Center, would we have done it? And the answer was absolutely yes. Are you going to trade the lives of a number of people because you want to preserve your honor? It is a wartime situation. It was more important to be successful than it was to be loved. If I had to do it over again, I'd do it in a minute.
Yep. What's remarkable about this film, other than the fact that Cheney has zero regrets, is the revelation that Cheney lied when he testified alongside President Bush for the 9/11 Commission. So, why can't Cheney seem to keep his story straight? And what implications does this have for the larger narrative pushed forward by the 9/11 Commission? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Robbie Martin, independent journalist and co-host of Media Roots Radio. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Abby.
So, Robbie, Cheney changes his story. Let me just briefly explain why. In this documentary on Showtime, he says that there was a shoot-down order, that he actually said he was going to shoot down the plane to save lives, which actually contradicts the 9/11 Commission report that says that there was no order made. Why do you think he changed his story here?
Well, because I think that he probably thought that people didn't remember that he had presidential emergency powers on that day. And I mean, the testimony shows that Cheney, was at least criminally culpable for not issuing an evacuation order from the Pentagon. And on top of that, he was acting as emergency president at the time because Bush was in the air the whole day.
Yeah, and you know what? This is actually a really important aspect of this, because Norman Mineta, there's a really important testimony from the Transportation Secretary who actually testified for the 9/11 Commission. It was omitted from the official report, but he says that there was some sort of order made, and let's hear this testimony.
During the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the Vice President, the plane is 50 miles out. The plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?
Okay, so here he is saying the order still stands. Cheney's directing him to do this. Obviously, there was an order for something. If it wasn't for a shoot-down order, what was it for?
Well, that's a great question, and that's something that the American public would probably love to have answered, but the problem is that testimony never actually made it inside the commission report. So, and Norman Mineta was actually asked about that later on. I think some activist independent journalists asked him about it, and he said that he wouldn't change anything he said in that testimony.
So Cheney, during the testimony, said the plane's 10 miles out, 20 miles out, 30 miles out. Does the order still stand? Cheney's saying, of course they still stand. Obviously, he's talking about a plane coming close. Why do you think there wasn't an evacuation order issued from the Pentagon?
Well, that's also a great question. 125 people died in the Pentagon attack alone. And I think the reason that, that hasn't been it's not talked about very much that he knew of the impending plane attack, because 3,000 people died on 9/11 and 125 people seems minuscule in comparison.
I mean, we're talking about criminal negligence here.
Potentially, yeah.
Unbelievable. And I think a lot of other people don't realize, I briefly mentioned in the intro, that Cheney and Bush testified together, not under oath. And this is where he can't really be claimed for perjury or anything like that, because they weren't under oath. They testified together. Let's see that Bush responding to some questions about why they did this.
President, as you know, a lot of critics suggested that you wanted to appear jointly with the Vice President so that you two could keep your story straight or something.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what you think of the value of appearing together and how you would answer those critics?
Yeah, first of all, look, I mean, if we had something to hide, we wouldn't have met with them in the first place. We answered all their questions, and as I say, I think I came away good about the session. because I wanted them to know, you know, how I set strategy, how we run the White House, how we deal with threats. The Vice President answered a lot of their questions. I answered all their questions. And I think it was important for them to see our body language as well, how we work together.
So, I mean, there he is. You know, it's a very bizarre answer. Why do you think that they didn't testify under oath here together? Or, I mean, that they were together, but they didn't testify under oath?
Well, I mean, they lied, first of all. I mean, why would someone not want to testify under oath unless they were planning on lying or, you know, obfuscating some part of the truth? And then on top of that, they testified together, not separately. I mean, I'd like to believe that Cheney was probably sitting in the corner sort of making faces at Bush, making sure he would, you know, stick to the story that he wanted to tell.
You know, I don't know that much about body language, but I've never really seen someone look more like they were lying than him right there. I mean, he can't even get his story straight. The guy's just like, what the hell are you talking about? Let's talk about the 9/11 Commission itself, though, because there's so many crazy inconsistencies, you know, and glaring omissions. But let's talk about who was originally appointed to be on it.
Well, Henry Kissinger was. Not just on it, but he was appointed to be the head of the entire commission. The 9/11 widows, the victims' families, were outraged by that, so they quickly replaced him with a guy named Philip Zelikow, who was basically a White House lackey who wrote a book with Condoleezza Rice on foreign policy. And then, you know, several people resigned, or one person resigned, Max Cleland, from the commission out of protest. I mean, the entire commission from the outset was set up to fail, and that was actually a statement made by the two people who ended up authoring the book that was put out, Lee Hamilton and King.
Yeah, they actually did say it was set up to fail from the beginning. I mean, it took months, longer than any other initiation of a commission after a major disaster or an event, and it was actually pushed by the widows, the families, who said, why isn't this being investigated? It really was, you know, blocked from the very beginning, and when they finally were forced to investigate it, they put on Kissinger, then Zelikow, all these very close people, a lot of like airline lobbyists and lawyers as well. Let's talk about some of the glaring inconsistencies with the report itself, because, you know, it just seems like they didn't really perform a real investigation. I mean, what do you think?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, the investigation was a total farce. I mean, they wanted the investigation, the commission, to tell the story that they wanted to tell. And when I say they, I mean that the White House wanted to tell. They omitted the war games that were going on the day of 9/11 that showed that the air defense response was delayed because all the jet fighters were tied up with war games. They omitted Building 7 falling. They omitted Able Danger, which was an investigation that had the identity of 4 hijackers as early as June of 2001 and knew that they were taking flying lessons. They omitted all of the warnings before 9/11, except for the famous PDB memo, which says Bin Laden determined attack in the U.S. That's the tip of the iceberg. There were many other warnings that were extremely specific leading up to the events that were not mentioned in the commission.
So, Robbie, what does this all say? I mean, obviously 9/11 was the crux of everything that we see today, the never-ending surveillance state, the curtailment of our civil liberties. I mean, do we need a new investigation? Do you think that they'll ever be held accountable? I mean, what do you think we should do here?
I mean, a new investigation, best case scenario, would be, you know, appointed by people in the government again. And obviously, the people who work in the government, the Obama White House now, they're not going to uncover that, you know, scab, as Nixon says in the movie by Oliver Stone. You uncover that scab and you get a lot of pus. And that's, I mean, that's the case with the 9/11 Commission. If they did another one, it would be another cover-up. So I guess for me, the only solution is just people just need to speak out about this and demand, you know, more answers.
Well, I think the question is, what are they hiding? What do all these things mean that they didn't cover in the investigation? Maybe we'll never know, but we definitely have to keep pushing for answers. Thank you so much, Robbie Martin from Media Roots.
Thank you, Abby.